Good afternoon, Ambassador Peters. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Ann Skeet. I'm the Director of Leadership Ethics here at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And we're delighted to have a former Santa Clara alum join us to share some insights about her career, both as a diplomat and now as the CEO of the Carter Center. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and your role at the Carter Center?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's always great to be back at Santa Clara, although it's hard for me to recognize the campus. It's changed quite a bit since I was here. As you said, I was a diplomat for many years, 32 to be precise, and as a diplomat, of course, I lived around the world. In fact, normally a diplomat bounces back and forth between Washington and overseas posts. But then at a certain point, it seemed that there were other appealing opportunities. So I spent some time in the management of security studies institutions, first in Germany at a U.S.-German partnership called the George C. Marshall Center, European Center for Security Studies, and then as provost of the U.S. Naval War College for 6 years, which, by the way, is a graduate school and not a place where the tactics of war are taught. Rather, it was founded by an admiral who described its mission as the study of war, the prevention of war, and the statesmanship connected with war. And from there, I got a phone call asking if I was interested in competing to be the CEO of the Carter Center. The Carter Center motto is waging peace, fighting disease, building hope, so who could resist? Well, the reason I think it's important is because it makes sense, and it's not just a fairness issue. It's not just a justice issue. Of course, it is both of those things, but it is proven to be an efficient way to attain peace and to sustain peace. And by it, I mean including women in aspects of conflict resolution and peace building. So that's the point, is that we don't have to choose between what's right and what's smart.
So it's interesting, in other sectors they might talk about, the business case for diversity and inclusion. Right. And so it sounds like you're drawing a parallel in the public sector as well, in the nonprofit work.
I am. This is definitely a business case as well as an ethical imperative. Well, I had the privilege of taking quite a few philosophy classes here, and I think the philosophy offerings were typical of a liberal arts college, particularly of a Jesuit liberal arts college. So, of course, I studied Kant and the categorical imperative, which I think was portrayed then and remains now almost a shorthand for the ethical life, the way in which you make ethical decisions. But before that, I remember a seminar freshman year when we talked about ethical dilemmas. And of course, we were young, 17, 18, so what are the teachers going to choose? Well, they chose that old dilemma, and I say that in quotes because it really ought not to be one, about the 99-year-old man in China. And if you could, with a blink of an eye and without any consequences, gain something in return for causing his death, would you do it? It starts out easy, for a new car, or, would you do that? And then you end up with, for world peace, would you end this man's life a few months or, or years early? So I do remember being confronted quite early in my Santa Clara career with these kinds of things, which, it's very easy to say, thou shalt not kill. That's very easy. Trust the Jesuits to understand that it's a little more complicated. Even if you ought not to blink your eyes for world peace, you ought to at least think about it. I would say they must. I mean, I really believe that ethics is one guide to how to live a good life. And what else should your ambition be other than to know how to live a good life and become better and better at thinking about that throughout your life?
Do you think that's something that can be taught?
I do. I do. I think the framework for thinking about ethics can be taught. I mean, philosophers have been wrestling with this for a long time, and you need to understand what the various frameworks are that you can use. The one that most people use is the greatest good for the greatest number, but as you know well, that's not the only one. And I think what needs to be taught is the value of looking at problems through different lenses to get the best possible triangulation, which is a hallmark of critical thinking, and that in itself is a hallmark of Jesuit education.
Yeah, and our framework for ethical decision making, which we provide to people in lots of different formats, including an app on your phone, is one way to promote that and sort of encourage people.
Well, I'll confess that I found out about the Markkula Center some years ago, and I've been using it on and off myself as a resource for many years. I think putting yourself in the other guy's shoes, the other woman's shoes, is the critical leadership trait. And I think that I would say that putting yourself on the line to protect what I call mavericks is another. A maverick, in my definition, is someone who does things a little differently and probably makes mistakes early in his or her career. All too easy for organizations, especially large organizations, to weed out those people because no one else has made a mistake. But of course, no one else has done anything noteworthy either. They just haven't made a mistake. So the people who make creative mistakes and never make the same mistake twice, those are the people I call mavericks. If they keep making the same mistake, that's a different category. But I do think that leaders owe it to the institutions they serve to protect the institution's capacity to change, and that means protecting those mavericks. This takes me back to my days at the Naval War College, Anne. When I arrived, an ethics conference was already part of the curriculum. It was, I think, a one-day affair, and I worked with the faculty to lengthen the conference to be able to spend more time on professional ethics. And the most important lesson that I think we tried to teach the students, and most of the faculty for that matter, was the importance of creating a structure that makes it easier to make the right decision. The example that we used was the example of the apples in the barrel. You can't just rely on the character of the apples. You have to create a barrel that enables them to be the best apples they can be.
And are there certain things you found that made the best barrels?
Well, I think we found that the ability to talk through dilemmas, in other words, making it okay for a military officer to ask questions, particularly one in a leadership position, to ask peers or supervisors about particular ethical dilemmas, treatment of prisoners and things like that, was important. So it was very important to give people permission to ask and not reinforce the stereotype that the military leader is a directive leader who has to know everything and basically tell his subordinates what to do. So the importance of communication, and then I would say the importance of foresight, the importance of really understanding what the dilemmas are that might come up in a particular circumstance. You know, it's not that hard in a combat zone or in a prisoner of war camp to imagine those, but it often doesn't get done. I think, yes, certainly there have, but I think there are also advantages. And I think that we must not take for granted the opportunities that women have had in the last few decades, because really those few decades need to be balanced against the weight of human history. Well, the first is that bringing more women into positions of power, and I mean power. Power means politics and political office and questions of war and peace and national security. Bringing more women into positions of power is necessary if we are going to get a handle on the problems we face in the world, particularly those that are conflict-driven. And as I said, it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, because there is evidence that bringing in women leads to better outcomes. The other thing I would say, though, is that the story I really want to tell is of women as agents for change, but there's still a story that has to be told, and I will start by telling this story this afternoon of women as victims, because women are still subjected to horrific human rights abuses. Many people are subjected to horrific human rights abuses, and many of those are men. But there's a whole category of abuses that are visited on women just because they were born female. There is, actually. We have 5 operating principles, and I'll go through a couple of them quickly. One is that we don't duplicate the effective efforts of others. So that's a value. It's really a value, not climbing on the bandwagon. Often there's funding for the issue du jour, but we prefer to find, to do something that others aren't doing effectively. Another is that, well, it's a corollary actually. Because we're doing things that others found unsavory or difficult, we tend to be operating at the end of the road in difficult places, difficult situations, and therefore, and I'll have to tell you, this is one reason why I applied for the job. When I saw this on the website, failure is an acceptable risk. And you know, most organizations claim to be risk takers. They don't want to be seen as risk averse. But they don't really internalize the fact that, statistically speaking, if you take enough risks, you're going to fail once in a while. So that's the second thing. But the real crux of the values that President and Mrs. Carter imbued in the organization is a respect for the dignity of the poorest of the poor. President Carter has often said that, you know, he's been to the end of the road. He's been to village after village beyond the end of the road with people who are the poorest people on the planet. But he says, I believe that the people in these villages are just as smart as I am. They're as ambitious as I am. They love their children as much as I do. They just need a helping hand. And that, I think, is the crux of the Carter Center.